talking about oil production in Libya primarily, but the principles hold anywhere. The first thing that anybody has to consider is where would you go to find oil or gas? And how would you know where to go? So let's talk about some basic principles. There are three kinds of rocks. And these are really important. They're sedimentary. This is where you find oil and gas. There are igneous rocks. And they're metamorphic. You don't find oil in the igneous rocks. That's like a rock that comes out of a volcano. Metamorphic are all kinds of rocks that are changed because of temperature and pressure. These are not places where you look. You look here, sedimentary rocks. Sedimentary rocks are rocks that have been laid down in layers. And in Libya, those layers were pretty much horizontal, but they had some dip and strike in some areas. But they consisted primarily of sandstone and alternating layers of shale. And I suppose there were some areas where you might even find limestone. So what is sandstone? Well, sandstone is really sand, just like you find on the beach. And if you put a whole bunch of sand grains together, you got space between them. That's loose sand, but sandstone has been cemented. So these grains of sand have cement connections, but there's still open spaces in there. So sandstone happens to be a really neat place to look for oil. The oil resides in the spaces between the grains and the cementing agent. Shale is another name for shale, could be mudstone. So really what shale is mud, just mud that's been lithified, which means it's been changed into rock. Now, interestingly enough, the shale particles are really small. It can be clay and things of that sort. But even though they're smaller than sand grains, there's still space in some shale. So in western United States, you have shale oil. And you have places all over the United States and elsewhere, even in the Sahara, where they produce natural gas that comes from shale and sandstone. So you have this sandstone, shale kind of alternating all the way down. Now some of those wells went down, if my memory holds, maybe 15,000 feet. Probably deeper, I don't know at this point. But these three kinds of rocks are where you would go to look for oil. So suppose you find sandstone and shale. Does that mean you're going to have any oil or gas? No. But you could have water. Every one of these zones that has sand and shale, because both rocks have space, will contain water. If you go deep, it's salt water. And as you go up, it moves toward fresh, toward the surface. So you could have a couple hundred feet of good, fresh water. And then you'd have brackish water, which is kind of a combination of salt water and fresh water. And all these things have to be taken into consideration. But our question is, how do you know where to go? How do you know where to drill? So there are a lot of things to help the person who's trying to find the oil and the gas. For one thing, are seismic surveys. Well, what's that? Well, a seismic survey is simply using a sound wave, which is directed downward into the rock itself. The intensity and energy behind the sound wave actually can make it go quite deep. When it hits anything, it bounces back. So seismic surveys can give a pretty good indication of what's down there. It doesn't say there's oil down there or gas, but it does talk about the geologic structures that are below the surface where you might be looking for oil or gas. So in the Sahara Desert, there was a lot of seismic work done before anybody drilled a well. They use explosives. They set off an explosive. The waves from that explosion go down through the earth and then bounce back up, and they have recorders that pick it up. Now, we're familiar with this. When we have an earthquake in some part of the United States, somebody says, oh, that's about a 5 on the Richter scale. Well, that's just a measure of the amount of energy that's been released underneath the earth, picked up in the same way that seismic energy is used for locating structures that might have oil or gas. Okay, so you can do the seismic work, but that hasn't told you anything about whether you have oil or gas down there. Now, what would really be nice is if you had some way of looking down there. Well, that's the first shot you've got. But the second one is really good, except it's expensive. You drill a well down there, and then you look and you see what kind of rocks that borehole went through. So the second thing is find out where any drilling has taken place in a particular location. Now, one of the costs of producing oil is you have to drill a lot of wells, and they may not produce anything. They're expensive. They're called dry holes or dusters. So, number one, you got seismic. Number two, you have existing wells or boreholes. If you know what's in an existing borehole, now you know what's down there. So here's a possibility. Suppose you have a square mile of lease that you own, and you've drilled 3 holes. And all 3 of those wells have the same sandstone shale consistency going on down to the bottom. And you happen to know that one of these, a particular sandstone, has actually evidence of natural gas in it. Well, if that zone shows up in all 3 of these control wells, where would you drill another one? Right in the middle. So existing boreholes with their geology, knowing that and at what depth these various zones are, which is easy to produce, that's what my company did, to tell them what's down there by using geophysical tools. Now you have another way of knowing where some oil and gas might be. Now, the big question, is there anything there? Well, I didn't tell you anything. Possibility. Is there anything there? Yeah, better possibility, but still you don't know. So what else do you need? You need some luck. It's by guess and by golly. You can know all kinds of things going into the investment in an oil well or a gas well. But you don't know what you have until you drill the well. So this is the basic approach for the production of oil and gas. Now, all this costs a lot of money. This is really expensive, every bit of it. But the amazing thing is, if you have the capital to do it, the payoff is unbelievable. And that's why we see oil production, gas production on every continent. Because people are looking for these sedimentary strata where there are possibilities for oil. Okay, just one more thing. The question is, some people have asked, well, aren't you looking for a pool of oil? Don't you have these sedimentary strata and there's a void space down there and it's filled with oil? No, oil does not have this type of reservoir down there. Oil is only found in the spaces between the particles in the rock. There is no pool of oil down there. It would really be cool if it was. It'd be easy to produce, but that's not the way it exists. It's always in the spaces between small rock particles. So this is not what you look for, but what you do look for, if you're looking for oil in an existing borehole, do you have sandstone or shale, for instance, with sufficient space to contain it, either the oil or the gas? My company provided a downhole survey that allowed you to estimate how much porosity, that is space between particles, there was, and actually to measure whether there was any oil in the spaces. So there's a lot of technology that goes in this, and it's very refined. I did this 60 years ago. I'm sure it's advanced beyond anything I can imagine. But there's one other thing. Let's suppose that the geological strata are fairly horizontal. Why would oil be here in this area, we'll call it A? Wouldn't you expect it if they're horizontal zones, that here at B we would find it as well? Possibly. But really you need a stratigraphic, what they call a stratigraphic trap. In other words, there has to be some geologic structure that traps the oil somewhere. Well, if you have oil in one zone and it just keeps going forever right and left, you'd think, well, hey, that's going to be filled all the way through, possibly. But generally what happens is oil gets trapped in certain geologic structures. So, for instance, if you have sedimentary strata that look something like this, and you've had a fault that's broken the earth, these are all over the place under the earth, a fault. If this zone right here, A, is a producer, but this portion of the rock has shifted upward, then this zone right here, which has no oil, has now shifted up here. So right here is a place where you could find oil. This would be one of those stratigraphic traps. The oil, by gravity, is horizontal. It can't flow any further this way because of this faulting. One portion of this rock is lifted up. So it's trapped in this particular area. So these fault lines and other geologic phenomenon that produce kind of a container to trap the oil is what you're really looking for. So the real thing on discovering more oil in a particular area is to use downhole geophysical surveys. And the company I work for, Schlumberger, provided those kind of surveys. By lowering instruments into the borehole, taking geophysical measurements, you could interpret that very accurately to decide whether you have a potential oil producer. Now, there's just one other thought. Years and years ago, when oil was being produced at places like Spindletop in Beaumont, Texas, this goes back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, the way you knew whether you had an oil well or not was you just started drilling. And if you hit a zone that had pressure in it, the oil would burst out. You'd have a blowout. Well, if you had a blowout, you knew you had oil. But the problem was that the blowout tended to be very destructive. The gas and oil coming up out of that rock borehole could create friction. It could catch on fire. And so you had innumerable cases where people were killed because they drilled into a high pressure zone where the oil or gas came out, ignited, and burned up the rig. Now those old rigs were made of wood, so they burned up too. So today you don't want a blowout. And we're going to talk about how do you drill a well really deep where you have immense pressures that could blow out instantaneously. How can you drill in there and prevent this high pressure gas or oil from coming back up the borehole? We'll talk about that in a future lecture. Thanks.